Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Ecology Live, the latest in our series of online talks from the British Ecological Society during the coronavirus lockdown period. I'm Jonathan Wood, and I'm Head of Society Programmes at the British Ecological Society. If this is your first time of joining us, you're very welcome. Why not join us every Thursday as we try and inject a bit of the latest ecological research back into our lives while so many of us are working from home. And welcome back to all those regulars who've been with us for many weeks. We know many of you are coming back again and again. So if you're enjoying these talks, why not consider joining the British Ecological Society to advance your science and your career? Just head to our website and find out all that membership has to offer. Access to our journals, discounted events, applying for grants. It's great value. And thanks as well to our sponsors, NHBS. NHBS supply equipment and books for ecologists and conservation professionals, and they're offering free European shipping until the end of the month for Ecology Live viewers. There'll be details at the end of the talk. So I'll shortly be introducing today's speaker, handing over to Diogo Verissimo, who's giving today's talk. But let me first quickly explain. There will be a short question and answer session at the end of the 25-minute talk. Please do submit your questions all the way through the talk using the Q&A box. There's no need to wait to the end. They can be named or anonymous, you can select which. We'll then pick a couple of questions to go through at the end and just see how many we get through in the time permitting. We're recording the talk and we will post the video to YouTube afterwards. So without waiting any longer, let me introduce today's speaker, Diogo Verissimo, who'll be explaining how we can use online sources to understand perceptions of wildlife around the world. Diogo.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let me share my screen. Wonderful. So thank you everyone for joining me in this talk around how we can use culturomics to better understand attitudes globally, or attitudes of human attitudes towards wildlife globally, and at a fine sort of time resolution. I'll start by of course thanking BES for having me in the seminar series and acknowledging my co-author in this work, Joss Wright, from the Oxford Internet Institute. Without further ado, we all know that monitoring matters. A lot of resources have been spent collecting information about wildlife populations globally. Some of this information can be or has been summarized in the Living Planet Index, for example. We also have other types of efforts, for example, the Audubon Christmas bird count that have been ongoing for a very long time, more than 100 years in this case. And so clearly there's a lot of value in collecting all this information. But of course, if we want to go beyond just documenting, in this case, in a lot of cases, declines, we need to think about the human dimensions. Now, we know human behavior is key because when we look at threats to biodiversity, all the key threats are driven by human behavior, whether it be invasive species, climate change, overexploitation, pollution. It really is, it boils down to choices that people make when they go about their everyday lives. And so not just, but it's not really just on the threat side, also on the conservation side, on the more conservation work side, we know that how society feels about a group of species or a biological group really matters. It really matters when it comes to deciding what to protect. It really matters when we're deciding where we're going to invest money, be it from donations or memberships of NGOs, be it public funding. We know that our priorities and the way we view different groups really makes a difference. And so it makes a difference. So we know that also it's the time, a really important time now to advance our science, our way of monitoring these human dimensions. This graph that I'm showing here right now is um, internet penetration globally. So you can see that as we've gone closer to 2019, which is the last year that we have data for, we have an increase in globally number of online internet users. And in the last couple of years, we actually have more people online than offline. And that's, I think, really a turning point. But it's not just the internet growth, is the fact that it's growing not just in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. And that is something I think is also important. When we look, for example, at advertising spending, we know that advertising spending is growing well in relative to all the other sources, such that probably for 2020, online advertising is going to be half of all spending, so will be the same as outdoor cinema, TV, radio, all put together. And the reason why advertisers are flocking to online is because that is where most people spend most time. And so it is really a crucial time for us to start thinking about how we can maximize the use of this online information. How can we maximize the potential of all this information that we have in a more sort of available format than ever, really. So this is not just a realization, that I've had. It's been out in the literature for about a decade now, and has its own conservation subdiscipline called conservation culturomics. We actually do have now a working group under the Society of Conservation Biology, and that's our webpage there, conservationculturomics.com. And of course, a shout out here to Ricardo Correa and Yuri Roll for really spearheading this effort. And so it's really been a group of people who's trying to push forward these methodologies and this maximizing the potential of this data. We also have an upcoming special issue on conservation biology. So if you're interested in this type of research or this type of way of studying nature, give it a look. Hopefully, come out in the coming month or so. So, coming back to this idea of monitoring human dimensions and really understanding how we can maximize the use of this data. When we're thinking about this challenge, we're thinking, well, what would a minimum viable product really look like? And this is sort of a schematics of the way we see this issue. It's really just about selecting what you want to talk or what you want to collect information about, in this case through, say, keywords most likely. Selecting data sources that you can use to retrieve some meaningful information. That will give you some sort of a raw data set that then you're going to have to filter, because of course wildlife is present in so many spaces, in so many aspects of our culture that, pardon me, whenever you try to collect information just through keywords, inevitably you're going to get a lot of content that doesn't really relate to wildlife. And so we need some sort of spam filter. That will give you a final data set that we can then map across time, across space, and perform sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is just, it's an automated way to look at whether the content of a particular bit of text is more sort of positive or negative. So it's framed more around positive or negative, using negative or positive words. And of course, this is an aspect that's really important. I'm not going to touch on it a lot in this presentation because we have limited time. But for this work that I'm going to present here, we use the off-the-shelf Sentiment R package, and of course that could be a whole separate talk in itself. So of course, for the purpose of this minimum viable product that we're hoping to develop, and that's what I'll be talking to you about here. We had to restrict ourselves to a few groups. We couldn't really work at the global scale. So we decided to pick a couple of, first, the usual suspects, of course, your rhinos, your tigers, your lions, your elephants, of course, but also some things that are a little bit different, the pangolins, orchids, and saiga. Now, of course, you'll see that obviously these are not single species groups. A lot of them are multi-species. But the reason for that is that it's often really quite hard to pin down single species when it comes to using data that is popular data, so non-scientific literature, it becomes sometimes hard to pin to specific species. And so we use these broader groups. In the case of the orchids, for example, really, really broad, because it's 20,000 plus species. But still, for the purposes of this initial exploration, that's how we framed our data gathering. In terms of our source, our data source, we focused on GDELT. So GDELT is an online repository of data. It receives in real time data from about 200,000 news media sources from every country on Earth. What it does is that for the content that is, whenever content is brought in that is not in English, it machine translates it into English, so that if it's retrieved through a query search, it can also be found. And when you use keywords to try to find content, it also translates those keywords across to about 100 languages, which are the ones included in the repository. And this sort of flexibility, together with the fact that it's free to access, it really enabled us to sort of test out a lot of this sort of a lot of these processes that we wanted to explore. I also mentioned that we had a spam sort of filter system. In this case, it's really something, I call it a spam filter, but it's really, that's because it really is what the mechanism that we used is like. It's very much like the spam filter you have in your inbox. It's exactly the same process. We used what is called a naive Bayes classifier to starting from a subset of data that we classified manually, then figure out which incoming articles were wildlife related and which ones were not wildlife related. And you can imagine there were quite a lot that were not wildlife related, because of course you have Puma Sportswear, you have Jaguar cars, you have all of that. And so obviously it did change sort of the data set quite a bit, and I think this is something worth highlighting in terms of doing this type of work. Now, in terms of temporal trends, when we looked at the temporal trends across this big data set, what did we find? Well, so for those groups that I mentioned, these are some of the results that we had. Of course, for elephants, lions, rhinos, and tigers, as you can imagine, the number of articles, and here the unit of analysis is the day. So this is daily number of articles. Much higher than for orchids, pangolins, and saiga, again, as you would expect. Interestingly enough, for the sort of charismatic megafauna groups, there seems to be a ceiling at around 200, that even when you have a peak, it doesn't go over that. But of course, I also say that this is only 10 months of data. We now, of course, continuously collecting data, but this data set that we analyze now is only for 10 months. So we'll see if there are the events that make the article counts go past this what for now seems to be a ceiling. Also interesting, of course, saiga and orchids, very, very little coverage, even if orchids, as I mentioned, is actually a group of 20,000 species, and very, very common as house plants as well, which I think highlights some of the dynamics around, really how much plants, to the extent to which plants are ignored when it comes to sort of the more popular narratives around wildlife. And I think worth highlighting also pangolins that had a couple of peaks, but also in the last month or so started having, we started to see more articles coming out, and let's see if in the future when we collect a little bit more data, if that sort of pans out as being as true as this popularity really sort of picking up. Now, we also looked at sentiment trends through time. So just to quickly explain what this means, so positive, when you have positive values of sentiment, it means that that the text is being framed in positive ways. When it's negative, it means that it's using more negative terms, right? So this might be negative in the case of wildlife. It might be killing, poaching. It might be disease. It might be whatever it could be. And so interesting, I think, to see some of these trends for, say, elephant, lion, rhino, and tiger, again, the charismatic megafauna. broadly positive sentiment, but also relatively narrow, so between 0 and 0.2. For orchids and pangolins, we see more variation, with orchids actually being one of the groups that has the most positive sentiment overall. And pangolins, interestingly enough, having perhaps the most sort of negative sort of peaks. And this is likely because a lot of the discourse in the press around pangolins is around these huge seizures, for example, which inevitably imply thousands of individuals dead. And so they're all framed in sort of quite negative ways, sort of the narratives around pangolin, which is probably why we have these sort of more of negative values. And of course, Saiga, it's really very limited, the number of articles, so we can't really say very much, from the data that we have at this point. Now, this is all temporally, right? In aggregate, over time, what does space or more spatial analysis reveal? And in this case, we are looking at it on a country basis. So, in our case, again, sort of a bit of a difference between orchid, saiga, and pangolin, and the other sort of charismatic megafauna groups. For these three that are sort of have less coverage, we see that the coverage is more homogeneous. We don't really see very big differences between countries, except that some countries have coverage and others don't. And actually, at this point, I should add that in what you're seeing now is number of articles normalized per number of sources, right? So divided by number of sources. And this is because GDELT does have hundreds of thousands or a couple of 100,000 sources, but these are not equally distributed around the globe. So about half of the sources are from Europe and North America. And so we had to account for that when we were looking at just the sheer volume of articles per country. But for example, for the elephants, lions, rhinos, and tigers, you can see that usually range countries popping up quite very strongly as countries where there's a lot of coverage around these species. So elephants, for example, India, Kenya, Tanzania, then some of the southern African states, where there's a lot of coverage. Rhino again, similar pattern, and tiger, of course. India is a key range country coming up. We're having a lot of coverage. Interestingly enough, though, also North America, both Canada and US, coming up are having a lot of coverage on this these taxa, which of course I think has repercussions as to sort of the types of narratives that we see portrayed in the press. Because of course it is quite different, the reality and the reality of living with these animals versus living quite far away from them. It does have impact on how people perceive these groups. So in terms of sentiment now, spatially, what we had this hypothesis when I just described it. We're going to find a big difference between range countries and non-range countries, particularly for these bigger groups or big megafauna, where there's a conflict associated with them, and so we would expect that sort of discrepancy to come out. But actually, we didn't really see that. So, for example, lion may be one of the best examples. We're seeing positive sentiment in places like Namibia, range country, and China and Papua New Guinea, which are non-range countries. In the case of, for example, the pangolin, we're seeing positive sentiment in places like Tanzania, which is a range country, but at the same time, neighboring Zambia, less negative sentiment even. So those are contrasts that we haven't really fully explored. There's a lot of, it really is at this point an analysis that generates more questions than it answers, I think. And so we haven't really explored that. Maybe it's also worth mentioning that, for example, for Saiga, of course, again, because coverage is the number of articles overall is quite reduced. Some of the trends that we see, for example, here we see Pakistan come up as a country with negative sentiment towards Saiga. This could be, or where Saiga is portrayed in sort of more negatively framed narratives. That's probably a better way of putting it. But this could be driven only by a few articles, right? So it becomes harder to to interpret when we have the number of articles is relatively small. Now, I think, personally, I get very excited about some of these results, and it's really interesting to think about what they mean and what they might mean, and how we could explain some of the trends that we're seeing. But it's also really important to highlight, I think, some of the big obstacles that this type of research faces. It is often really easy to, as I said, to get excited with these data sets, but there are some really big constraints, and that could be a whole series of VS talks in itself. But here I'm just going to focus on a couple of the ones I think are the most interesting, and also the ones that enable me to share with you a few more colorful maps, which I'm sure everyone can get behind. So the first one is that, in relation to the graph that I showed in the beginning, with internet adoption across the world, there's actually a big divide between developed and developing, or higher income and lower income countries. And so whenever, and of course this is also reflected in GDELT's data sources as well. And so this information is, the information is just not distributed equally. And of course, when we care about narratives around wildlife, that these are going to change, and it's going to impact the data that is available, that is produced for us to analyze, and that is worth bearing in mind. We expect this inequality to close, but it will take time for it to be similar. Right? That's worth, I think, noticing. So the other thing that I think is worth thinking about is in terms of data sources, the use of data sources, different data sources. So what we did also in parallel was we looked at Alexa ranks. So these are this website basically ranks the most popular sites within the country. And in this case in particular, we looked at the top 100 websites that are the most popular. And so we did that for media websites and for social media, and I think that really the message I want to get out with this is that even at the national level, there's a lot going on when it comes to the number of sources, and so it's really key that whenever we're doing work like this, that we try to be as inclusive as we can in terms of sources, right? We use multiple sources so we can triangulate and sort of complement the data sets as much as possible. We also did in parallel analysis around the most popular social media sites, because of course social media is a really appealing source of data for analyses like this. And I think one of the interesting things about it is that, of course, Facebook's very dominant, but it's also interesting that even if we did have access to Facebook data, which is a bit harder these days, by looking just at that information source, even in a situation where it's so dominant, we would be excluding specific parts of the globe, or having a bias against certain regions. And I think that would again alter our understanding and what the results of our analyses, if we were to focus on, for example, on species that are particularly distributed in this region, say for example Saiga. So that's something else to bear in mind in terms of really understanding our analysis results through the lens of the initial data set that we started with. Beyond data availability, we also looked at language, and this is important because, of course, sentiment analysis is a linguistics analysis, and so most of the tools were designed for English. But in this case, for example, we know that looking at those top 100 websites, there were a number of different languages used, even just in a single country. Right, in some countries had more than 10 languages, and so again, very often it's easy to default to the single sort of leading or dominant language, but there's a lot going on, even just at the national level. So for us to try to do anything that's global, we'll need to really take that into account, and we are able to create tools that can take into account sort of this diversity across languages. And of course, just to follow the same patterns that we did with social media, we also looked at dominant languages, and unsurprisingly, of course, English is very dominant when it comes to online use. But again, some regions of the globe don't seem to have don't have English as a dominant language online. And so if we just use, say, for example, English keyword searching for analyses that don't have this flexibility across language like GDELT has, for example, we will be biasing our data sets towards particular regions of the globe with particular impacts, I think, on the narratives that we see around wildlife. So that's really it. I'll leave you with my website, my email, and my Twitter accounts. Please do engage. Please do drop me a line if you have any questions or suggestions. I'll be really happy to engage. And of course, if there are any editors in the audience, we are hoping to submit the manuscript on these results till the end of the month. So if you feel like the journal is a good fit for this type of content, please do drop us a line. We are keen to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Diogo, for that fascinating talk. So we've had a few questions coming in, and they're coming in all the time. So let's get through as many of them as we can quickly. So the first one that came in was from Kat Jones, and it was when you were explaining the spam filter stage. She asks whether it's worth considering the non-wildlife context that keywords come up in. She uses the example that the word vulture is used in referring to politicians. I don't know whether she had some politicians more in mind than others, but vulture might give use, and its use in this way might give useful information on how the animals are perceived.
Yes, certainly. Certainly, that's not something we have considered thus far. I'm sure, and we know that those metaphors are not random, right? There are reasons why those associations are made. So certainly that's something which I honestly had not considered. We'll definitely have to give that a think. I guess at this point, because we are at the relatively sort of early stages, we just want to sort of decouple that content that directly refers to wildlife from the one that is sort of more sort of indirect, and perhaps sort of analyze them separately, I guess, at the minimum. But yeah, thank you. I really do appreciate that suggestion. I think it will be something we'll have to reflect on and see how we can best incorporate.
Great, thanks. Rebecca Sargent asks, as do a number of people actually, for a bit more detail on how the sentiment analysis works. You said it could be a whole talk by itself, but if you could keep this brief, please. She asks, does negative sentiment mean the public are viewing the animal negatively? Or does it mean that the article was negative, for example, about poaching? Yeah,
so that's a very good question. So the way it works, the mechanics of it is that the algorithm goes through the portion of text and looks at words that are seen to be or considered to be negative and or positive within the text, and then does sort of a calculation of how that works out across the text. Now, this particular package does take into account, for example, negative, so not beautiful, right? So for example, things like that, it does take into account those things, but it is about the overall, it is about the overall way that it is framed, and not necessarily about the species specifically, right? So for example, in the case of pangolins is a good example, where if you have an article that it's all about how thousands have been found dead, where there's the issue in itself is about trafficking, it's about all those types of things. You might end up with a negative sentiment overall, even if the article in itself, what it says is not necessarily negative about the species. What we're hoping to do now, and this is, as I said, we used off-the-shelf sort of tools, and these are not really geared towards wildlife. They were developed for things like, for example, Amazon reviews, TripAdvisor reviews, so content that's much more standardized. And so what we're hoping to do now is our next stage. We're hoping to use some citizen science to help us fine-tune some of these tools and really get down to or sort of develop tools that will enable us to pinpoint in a much more exact way what it is that different articles are saying. And so hopefully that's definitely an aspect that needs improving, and then we'll need to develop more and better solutions.
Great, sounds like an interesting citizen science project to get involved with. the next question is a great question from Manzoor Shah in University of Kashmir in India. He asks how you think this variation in sentiment and information across taxa influences the conservation status, and how best can we use that? How can we factor that into conservation models for rare wildlife species?
Yeah, no, a wonderful question. So, so we know that, for example, when it comes to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, when it comes to other sort of strong policy instruments, when it comes to donations, for example, we know that species that are more appealing, that the public prefers, get more support. And so, how exactly that pans out in terms of impacts to the status, I think it's less clear, because of course we have to sort of think about it in a counterfactual way, right? So what would have happened if that support had not been given, right? And so it's more complicated than just simply looking at the current status, how much support the species gets, and is it good or bad? Because of course, maybe if he had not received support, it would have been even worse, right? So I think there's some nuance to explore there. I'm not sure we're clear exactly what the relationships are, but I'll say this at a very broad scale, right? So if you compare, for example, just say animals and plants, or vertebrates and invertebrates, right? We will see that those groups that have this more society cares more for are in better shape, to the extent that, for example, for invertebrates or plants, we don't really even have any sense of what we're losing, right? And then if you look at the red list, for example, there are big holes when it comes to those groups, as opposed to, say, amphibians or birds or mammals, where there definitely are huge challenges when it comes to extinction, but at least we have a good sense of what we have, right?
Yeah, great. Yes, and I'm sure finding the right counterfactuals is really difficult. I think I'll try and squeeze one more question in. This one comes from Grace Nolan, and it sort of comes on from what you were just saying. Have you considered applying this work to reptiles and amphibians, which tend to have generally less positive views by the public and are considered less charismatic? What do you think?
No, it's definitely. I think one of the challenges almost with this work is that you can take it in so many different directions. So there's the need to improve the sentiment analyses. We need much better tools. But at the same time, we also would like to know what's happening with other groups, as you say, reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, plants. What's going on with all these different biological groups? And so I think I've sort of made a conscious effort of trying to stick with these few groups for now, while we improve our processes. And so only after we'll have something a bit more refined, because I think at this point it's a bit sort of rough around the edges, will we then expand the coverage of the different biological groups. But we absolutely, it is the case that we would like to get to a place where we would like to include a much broader diversity of taxa in this kind of work.
Great. Well, that seems like a perfect place to end. Thanks very much again, Diogo.
Thanks very much, Jonathan.
So it just remains for me to really thank everyone for joining us online. And if you haven't had your question answered today, Diogo did mention he's on Twitter. Use his Twitter handle, maybe send him a message. And we're also keen to hear what you think of the Ecology Live series of talks. We've been broadcasting them since mid-April now. And so we'll shortly be sending you a link to a very short survey. Please do follow the link and tell us what you think. It'll take you just 2 or 3 minutes. It'll just help us think about the value of these talks and where we go next with them as the coronavirus situation continues to change. Next week, at the same time, Ecology Live is given by Juliet Vickery from the RSPB. She'll explain how that organisation is using science to conserve species and sites around the world. And finally, I'll leave you with details of that offer I mentioned right at the very start from the sponsors of today's Ecology Live talk. That's NHBS. And you should be able to see the discount code there for free European shipping. See you next Thursday.